My name is Marisol Vidal. I am 31 years old, and for most of my life I believed that if you worked hard enough inside a family, the family would eventually see it. I was wrong. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, or at least not the kind that sits in your chest and won't move. I say it the way you say a fact about weather. It rained for 3 years. The roof held anyway. That kind of thing. But I want to back up because the dinner table moment, the one where my mother looked across the roast chicken and the good plates and said what she said, that was not the beginning. That was the night I finally understood what the beginning had been. There's a difference between those two things that matters more than I can explain in a single breath. And there's something else I should tell you up front. In the weeks before that dinner, I had put a brown accordion folder in the back seat of my car. I had been waiting for the right moment to bring it inside. I did not know that moment was coming on a Thursday in October. But I had known it was coming. So let me start where it actually started. In a house on Dunmore Street in central Ohio, in a family where my father ran a small commercial cleaning company he had built from a single contract and a used van, and where everything, from the dinner conversation to the Christmas budget to who got to sit in the front seat, was organized around one unspoken truth. My sister Gabriella was the one who mattered more. I want to pause here for a second because if you're watching this and you come from a family where you were the one who held things together while someone else got the credit, I want you to know that this story is for you. What happened at that dinner table, what I did afterward, I didn't plan it. But looking back, I had been building toward it for years without knowing it. Keep watching. My father, Ernesto Vidal, started Vidal Building Services the year before I was born. By the time I was old enough to understand what he did for work, the company had 6 employees, 3 commercial contracts, and a reputation in our part of the county for showing up on time and not cutting corners. My father was proud of that. He talked about it the way other men talked about military service, with a gravity that discouraged follow-up questions. I grew up in that company the way some kids grow up in restaurants or hardware stores. I rode in the van on Saturdays. I learned to read a cleaning schedule before I learned to read a map. By the time I was 12, I could calculate labor hours against a square footage estimate without using a pencil, because my father had made a game of it on long drives and I had learned that getting the right answer made him smile in a way that almost nothing else did. I want to be careful here because I am not painting my father as a monster in the early years. He wasn't. He was a man who loved his work and was not always sure what to do with the people around him, and those two things coexisted in him in a way that I spent a long time trying to understand. What I understood by the time I was in high school was this. Gabriella was beautiful in the way that stopped conversations, and I was competent in the way that kept them running. Gabriella got invitations. I got assignments. And in my family's economy, invitations were the currency that counted. Gabriella is 3 years older than me. She had our mother's coloring, warm tan skin, dark eyes that caught light in a way that made people lean toward her without knowing they were doing it. She was not unkind to me, not exactly. She was indifferent in the specific way of someone who has never needed to be unkind because the world has arranged itself around her comfort without her having to ask. I did not resent her for that. What I resented, what I didn't have a word for until much later, was the way my parents looked at her versus the way they looked at me, and the fact that the gap between those two things was apparently invisible to everyone except me. I graduated high school with a 3.9 GPA and an offer to study business administration at a state university 40 minutes from home. My parents came to graduation. My father shook my hand and said I should be proud. My mother took 17 photographs of Gabriella in the stands. I don't know if that detail is funny or sad. I've decided it's just true. I commuted to college because tuition was tight and my father needed help with the company's scheduling on weekday evenings, and I had told him I would handle it. That is what I told myself for 4 years while I built the company's first real client database, redesigned the invoicing system, and negotiated 2 new contracts that my father signed without ever asking how I had gotten the other party to agree to our terms. He didn't ask because it didn't occur to him that it had required skill. I think he assumed those things happened the way clean floors happened, because someone had shown up and done the work, and the work was not the kind that required explanation. If you've ever watched someone you love fail to see you, not in a dramatic way, not cruelly, just the quiet, ongoing failure of attention, you know that it accumulates differently than an insult does. An insult you can name. This other thing you just carry. After I graduated, I came on officially at Vidal Building Services as operations manager, a title my father gave me without a formal contract, without a salary discussion, and without telling anyone else in the company what the title actually meant. What it meant, in practice, was that I ran the schedule, handled client complaints, managed the payroll software, and drove to job sites when a crew lead called out sick, which happened more often than my father liked to admit. My father's role during this period was to shake hands, attend Chamber of Commerce lunches, and deliver the kind of confident overview speech that made new clients feel they were dealing with someone serious. He was good at that. I am not being sarcastic, he genuinely was. He had a presence that I did not inherit, and that I spent a long time wishing I had, before I understood that what I had instead was more durable in the ways that actually mattered for keeping a company alive. My salary, when we finally had a formal conversation about it 2 years in, was $38,000 a year. The market rate for an operations manager of a company our size was between $52,000 and $68,000. I told myself there would be a right moment to raise it. There wasn't for a long time. Gabriella, during this period, was living in Columbus. She had started a lifestyle blog that had a modest following, taken a few brand deals, and was, as my mother described it at every family dinner, really finding her footing. My mother said this with the specific warmth she reserved for Gabriella, a warmth that was not cold toward me exactly, just calibrated differently, the way a lamp is warmer toward whatever it's pointed at. My father would nod when my mother talked about Gabriella's footing, and then ask me about the Henderson contract or whether I had followed up with the school district. This was, I came to understand, the fullest expression of his pride in me, that he needed my answer, that the question couldn't wait. I told myself for years that this was a form of respect. I was 31 years old before I stopped believing that. The first time my father said something I could not explain away, I was 26, and we were sitting in the small office at the back of the warehouse space we rented on Kellner Road, going over the quarterly numbers. The numbers were good. We had just closed out a quarter with a 17% revenue increase over the same period the prior year, and I had the comparison sheet in front of me. I had stayed late 2 Tuesdays in a row to build it, and I had decided this was the moment I was going to ask my father about the salary adjustment. I walked him through the numbers. He nodded. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both of which I answered without hesitation. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He did this when he was pleased, a private satisfaction that he didn't quite know how to give outward form to, and I thought, now. I said I wanted to talk about compensation. I said I had looked at market rates and I had some numbers I wanted to share. My father looked at me for a moment. Not unkindly. With something that was almost confusion. He said, Marisol, you're not in a position to be negotiating. You're learning the business. I was 26. I had been doing the job for 4 years. I had redesigned the invoicing system, built the client database, and just delivered a 17% revenue quarter. I said, I think I'm past the learning phase, Dad. He said, your sister was never like this. Gabriella never made things complicated. I folded the comparison sheet in half and set it down on the desk between us. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I asked what Gabriella's business experience had to do with my salary. He said, I'm just saying. Some people know how to be gracious about what they have. He approved a $2,000 annual raise, approximately $38 a week before tax. I drove home on the interstate with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and I did not let myself cry until I was in my own driveway, and even then it was brief. It was mostly about the fact that he had reached for Gabriella's name in that moment, as a way of saying, there is a version of a daughter who doesn't do this, and she is the one I prefer. And I had been sitting across the desk from him, with the quarterly numbers between us, and I had still been the wrong kind of daughter. That year's Thanksgiving was the first time I noticed the seating arrangement. Gabriella sat to my father's right, and I sat at the far end of the table near the kitchen. My mother brought the food out in courses, and each time she set something on the table, she paused behind Gabriella's chair and touched her shoulder. Just briefly. Just in passing. I counted. She did it 4 times. She did not touch my shoulder. Afterward, I sat in my car in my parents' driveway for 6 minutes before I could make myself start the engine. It was 40 degrees and the windshield fogged from the inside, and I watched it slowly clear. I thought about the comparison sheet folded on my father's desk and the 4 shoulder touches and the $38 a week, and I thought, I have been counting wrong for a very long time. That night was the first time I understood that waiting for them to see it on their own was not a strategy. It was just waiting. The next 5 years did not get better. Let me tell you about 2 moments because they matter for what happened later. The first was a contract I won alone. In the spring of my 27th year, I put together a proposal for a commercial real estate firm that managed 11 properties across 2 counties, the largest single contract we had ever pursued. I spent 3 weeks on it, evenings, weekends, 1 full Sunday where I did not leave the house. My father did not know I was pursuing it. I had decided to build the case and present the outcome, rather than ask permission and have the thing dismissed before it had a chance. I went to the meeting alone. The client was skeptical at first. Then I answered his third question with a cost per square foot breakdown that I had ready in 3 versions, and something shifted, the way it does when someone stops testing you and starts actually talking to you. We signed a letter of intent 6 days later. I brought the signed letter to my father on a Tuesday morning and set it on his desk. He read it twice. Then he picked up his phone and called his brother, and I heard him say, "Hector, you're not going to believe the contract we just landed." "We." I stood in the doorway and listened to him say we. I squared the papers on his desk and turned and walked back to my own office without saying anything. The second moment was the summer I turned 29. My father had a health scare, a cardiac irregularity that turned out to be manageable with medication, but frightening enough that I took on the full operational load without being asked. During those 6 weeks, I handled vendor negotiations, covered site visits he had been scheduled for, and kept payroll from going out late when our accounting software had a licensing issue. Gabriella came home for 1 weekend. She sat with him, brought the orange juice he preferred, and cried when she hugged him goodbye. He held her face in his hands and told her she was a good daughter. I kept the company running. I kept the clients from knowing anything was uncertain. At the end of those 6 weeks, my father came back, shook my hand in the parking lot, and said, "I knew you'd hold things together." He said, "Gabriella was a real comfort to me. Having her here made a difference." I said, "I'm sure it did." I got back in my car. I had 3 site visits that afternoon and a vendor call at 5. Over those 5 years, 26 to 31. Here is what I built. I grew the client roster from 11 contracts to 29. I held labor costs flat for 3 consecutive years while expanding output by redesigning crew rotations to eliminate the overlap hours eating into margin. I negotiated supply agreements with 2 vendors that cut consumable costs by 19%. I built a client retention system that reduced contract churn from 7 lost in 4 years to 2. I managed HR informally but really. The hiring, the onboarding, the terminations, the conversations with crew members who needed a reassignment rather than a write-up. My father passed those to me without saying so, just by not being available when they needed to happen. I did all of this at $38,000 a year for the first 2 years, then $40,000, then $43,000 after a conversation in which I showed my father a printed industry salary benchmark and he told me I was making him feel like an adversary. The company, by the time I was 31, was generating just over $2.4 million in annual revenue. I knew this number exactly because I ran the books. My father knew it roughly, the way a person knows the temperature outside, enough to dress appropriately, not enough to give you the reading. I knew it exactly. I had also by that point done one other thing. I had done it quietly, without telling anyone, and I had been doing it for 3 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The dinner happened on a Thursday in October. My parents hosted Thanksgiving 2 weeks early that year because Gabriella had made plans to spend actual Thanksgiving with her boyfriend's family in Nashville, and my mother had decided that the calendar should rearrange itself accordingly. I did not have plans. I was not consulted. I drove to Dunmore Street and brought a sweet potato casserole because my mother had asked me to bring one, and I helped with the finishing touches on the rest of the food because that was what I did, and at 6:15 we all sat down to eat. Gabriella had driven up from Columbus. She had brought wine, a bottle of something Italian that my father praised without knowing anything about Italian wine, and she sat to his right without anyone directing her there because that was just where she sat. The conversation was good in the way those conversations always were. My father talked about a new commercial development on the east side of town. My mother asked Gabriella about Nashville and listened with her full face and her body slightly turned, the particular attention she gave things she considered genuinely interesting. I ate my food. I answered when addressed. It was after the main course, while my mother was in the kitchen with the dessert plates, that my father said what he said. He had been talking about the business, about a referral he'd gotten from a Chamber of Commerce contact, and he said with easy satisfaction that he was thinking it was time to start thinking about the future. Gabriella asked what he meant. He said he meant the long term. Who was going to take care of things? What it would look like for the business to stay in the family. I looked at him. I had my fork in my hand. He said he'd been thinking about bringing Gabriella in. Not right away, but eventually. When she was ready to settle down from the blog work and wanted something more stable. He said she had good instincts with people and that the business needed someone with that quality if it was going to grow into the next generation. Gabriella said she didn't know anything about operations. My father said, "You'd learn. That's what the people around you are for." He did not look at me when he said it. He was looking at Gabriella. I set my fork down. I set it on the edge of my plate and kept my hands flat on the table and said nothing. She set one in front of Gabriella, touched her shoulder, set one in front of my father, and set mine down without looking at me. She said, looking at Gabriella, "You are so much more like your father than Marisol is. You have his instincts." My father smiled. Then my mother looked across the table at me, not unkindly, with the specific look I had seen 100 times, the look that was almost apologetic, and that was worse than cruelty because it meant she had considered it and decided it was just true, and she said, "You're not half the woman your sister is, Marisol. Gabriella just has a way with people that you've never quite had." The table was quiet for a moment. My father nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when someone said something he considered accurate. I felt the back of my neck go cold. I pushed my chair back from the table. Not dramatically, I slid it back, the way you do when you're going to stand up and go to the kitchen for something. Unhurried. I stood up. My mother looked up at me. I said, "Then she can start paying your rent." My father's expression did not change for a moment. Then it did. He said, "Rent? What rent?" And that was when I understood that we had arrived, finally, at the beginning of the part that actually mattered. I did not answer him right away. I straightened the napkin next to my plate, folded it once, set it on the table. Then I said, "I'll get the paperwork." I went to my car. Not to leave. I went because that was where I had put the accordion folder, the brown one with the elastic cord and the button closure. 3 days earlier, when I drove to my parents' house to drop off a casserole dish, I had decided then that I would bring it to the next family dinner and see whether the moment arrived. I had not known the moment would arrive this particular Thursday. But I had known it would arrive sometime, and I had been ready for some time for about 6 months. I carried the folder back inside under my arm, through the front door, past the coat rack, and into the dining room, where my father was still sitting at the head of the table and my mother and Gabriella had not moved. All three of them watched me walk in the way people watch something they are not sure how to categorize. I set the folder on the table. I unwound the cord from the button and opened it and took out the first document, a lease agreement, 3 pages, stapled in the upper left corner, and I placed it in front of my father. He looked at it. He looked at me. He said, "What is this?" I said, "That's the lease on 4400 Kellner Road. The warehouse." He said, "I know what Kellner Road is, Marisol." I said, "Then you'll recognize the name on the lessor line." He picked it up. He read the top page. His jaw shifted. The name on the lessor line was mine. I had bought the building 2 years and 4 months earlier when the previous owner, a property management company out of Columbus, had listed it quietly without going to a broker, and I had found out through a vendor contact and moved quickly. The purchase price was $380,000. I had put down $110,000 in cash, saved over 7 years of living carefully, and financed the remainder through a commercial lender at a rate I had negotiated myself. The lease I signed with Vidal Building Services was $2,200 per month, 5-year term renewal clause. My father had signed that lease. He had never asked who owned the building because it had not occurred to him to ask. When I bought it, the lease payments started flowing to me. He had been paying me $2,200 a month for 2 years and 4 months to use a building he had assumed belonged to someone else. He set the lease agreement down. He said very quietly, "You own this building." I said, "I do." He said, "Since when?" I said, 2 years and 4 months. "You've been current on every payment." "I appreciate that." My mother said, "Ernesto." My father held up one hand without looking at her. His face had a quality I had not seen on it before, a particular stillness that I recognized as the thing that happens when a person's understanding of a situation rearranges itself faster than they can speak. He said, "Is there more?" I reached into the folder and produced the second document, 8 pages bound with a binder clip, and placed it on top of the lease. He picked it up. He read the first page. His eyes moved down the page and stopped. It was a report from a business valuation firm, commissioned 4 months earlier, assessing Vidal Building Services as a going concern. The number at the bottom of the executive summary was $1.9 million for the operational business, excluding real property. Including the building I owned, total enterprise value, $2.4 million. My father had never seen what the company was actually worth as an asset, measured by someone with no stake in flattering the answer. Gabriella said, "Dad, what does that mean?" He didn't answer her. I said, "It means the business is worth $1.9 million on paper, not including the building. The building is worth $510,000. I own the building. If you want to renew the lease at the end of the 5-year term, we'll negotiate that then. If you want to relocate, you're free to do that too." My father said, "You never told me you were doing this." I said, "You never asked what I was doing." He looked at the folder, which still had something in it. He said, "Is there more?" I said, "There's one more thing." I reached in and produced the third document, 2 pages from a business attorney, and set it on the table. It was a memo outlining the terms under which I was prepared to formalize my role at Vidal Building Services, a documented equity stake reflecting 7 years of operational contribution, a salary adjustment to market rate retroactive to the prior fiscal year, and a formal succession clause naming me as the operational successor in the event my father chose to step back. The right moment to present it, it turned out, was a Thursday in October, after someone said I was not half the woman my sister was. My father's hands were flat on the table. He was doing something quieter and harder than shouting, trying to hold his understanding of himself steady against what was in front of him and not quite managing it. He said, "You've been planning this." I said, "I've been working." "There's a difference." Gabriella stood up. She picked up the valuation report and read the first page and set it back down. She looked at me with something I could not read, not quite surprise, not quite the absence of it. She said, "You own the warehouse." I said, "I do." She said, "Since before Christmas 2 years ago." I said, "Since August 2 years ago." She sat back down and picked up the wine glass and held it without drinking from it. My mother had been quiet since she said my father's name. She was looking at her plate. I had expected her to redirect the conversation the way she always did when a family scene was going somewhere she didn't want it to go. But she wasn't doing that. She was sitting very still, and I understood that she was not sure what there was to defend. My father said, "I want to know how you financed this." I said, "Savings. And a commercial loan I arranged myself, through a lender I found myself, with terms I negotiated myself." He said, "How much did you save?" I said, "Enough for the down payment. Over 7 years. On the salary you paid me." He heard what I meant. The room was quiet. Then he said, "I didn't know you had that kind of initiative." I picked up my water glass. I set it back down. I said, "I know you didn't." We did not finish dessert. My father asked to keep the documents overnight, and I said he was welcome to review them and I would follow up the following week. I put the folder back together, wound the cord around the button, and tucked it under my arm. I told my mother the sweet potato casserole was good. I meant it, she had always made it well, and that was a separate thing. Gabriella walked me to the front door. At the door she said, "I didn't know, Marisol, about any of it." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "I don't want to take over Dad's business. I never said I wanted that." I said, "I know. That was his idea, not yours." She nodded. I put on my coat and I left. I sat in my car for a few minutes before I started the engine. The street was the way it always was at that hour. A few lit windows, a dog somewhere, the particular stillness of a residential block in October. My breath fogged slightly in the cold air before the heat came on. My father called 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, and asked if I could come over. I said I would come Sunday afternoon. When I got there, my mother made coffee and sat at the table with us. My father had the documents in front of him, the folder open, pages laid out. He had clearly read them more than once. He said, "I owe you some things I haven't said." I folded my hands on the table and waited. He said, "I've been thinking about what I said at dinner. About bringing Gabriella into the business. I want you to know I didn't mean it the way it came out." I said, "How did you mean it?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think I meant that I wanted to have something to give her. She doesn't have what you have, and I think I knew that, and I wanted to give her something anyway." I said, "Dad, I want to tell you what I was actually doing." I didn't have notes. I had been over it enough times that I didn't need them. I said, 4 years ago, in your office on a Tuesday, you told me I wasn't in a position to be negotiating. That I was learning the business. What I was actually doing when you said that was finishing the Harrison Street proposal on my own kitchen table, the one I brought you sign the following week." He looked at the table. I said, "When you came back from your health scare, you told me Gabriella had been a real comfort and that having her there had made a difference. What I was actually doing during those 6 weeks was running the full operational load, covering your vendor meetings, keeping the payroll from going out late, and making sure not one client knew anything was uncertain." My mother put her coffee cup down. I said, "The night of the dinner, Mom told me I wasn't half the woman Gabriella was. What I was actually doing at that moment was sitting at a table in a home I had helped sustain, across from a family that had been cashing my work for 7 years without putting my name on any of it." My father said, "Marisol." I said, "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that what I built isn't separate from this family. It is this family. Every contract I closed, every crew rotation I redesigned, every vendor negotiation I won. That was me, keeping the thing you started alive. I need you to know that before we talk about what comes next." He nodded. He did not say anything for a moment. Then my mother, who had been quiet through all of it, said, "I didn't know how to see you right." It was the most honest thing she had said to me in years. It didn't fix anything. But it was real and I heard it and I let it land. I picked up my coffee. I said, "Then let's start there." My father and I signed a formal agreement 3 months later. I took a documented equity stake, 35%, earned through contribution, not gifted, and my compensation was restructured to market rate with a retroactive adjustment for the prior year. The lease on Kellner Road stays in my name. We negotiated the renewal terms together, with a mediator my attorney recommended, and we both signed the revised contract at a table that had nobody's name at the head of it. That part was important to me. The table with nobody at the head of it. Gabriella sent me a text the week after the Sunday conversation that said simply, "I always knew you were the one holding it up." I should have said so out loud. I did not know what to do with that message for several days. Then I decided it was enough, and I saved it, and I moved on. The thing I keep coming back to, when I think about all of it, is this. I spent a long time trying to be seen by people who were looking in a different direction, and the answer wasn't to step into their line of sight. It was to build something solid enough that eventually the light came to me instead. I don't think my parents were villains. I think they were people with a fixed idea of who each of their daughters was, formed early and never revised, and I think that is one of the more common and quieter ways that families fail each other. Not in the dramatic moments, not in the shouting, but in the slow accumulation of not updating what you see when you look at someone you think you already know. The paperwork helped. I won't pretend it didn't. There is something about a signed document, a real number, a building on a street with your name on the deed, that makes it harder for people to see around you. I did not set out to build leverage. I set out to build something real. The leverage was a side effect. But here's what I'd say to anyone who has ever cleared the plates, covered the gaps, stayed late, and watched someone else get the credit. The work is not invisible. It accumulates, the way savings accumulate, the way compound interest accumulates, quietly, without announcing itself, until one day there is enough of it that it changes the shape of the room. That is what happened at our dining room table in October. The room changed shape. Not because I raised my voice, not because I made a scene, because I had been building for 7 years, and the building was finally finished, and it was time to let everyone see it. If this story felt true to something you've lived, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not for me, for them. Sometimes the most useful thing you can give someone is the words for what they've already experienced. The names, events, and circumstances in this story are fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals or actual events is coincidental.